I simply do not understand humans. I suppose that's not a surprise, though. There was never a need. Not back in my younger days, before my cultivation, and not when I had achieved my status of yokai. When I was nothing but a spider, nestled in the dense forest of the mire, I had little care for humans other than the private understanding that they were large, brutish, and destructive. Where humans went, webs were broken, prey was scattered, and my kind were crushed and swatted. I cannot honestly say that I hated them, per se. I had no reason to hate them. I had not been personally harmed by their kind, nor had I suffered any significant loss from their actions. True, I know my mother was crushed to death by one not long before my birth, but I held no true love for my mother. None of my siblings did. Spiders do not care for their own in that way. We do not love each other as humans do. I respected my mother for bringing me into this world, but eventually we would be rivals for resources, as would my siblings. I knew our relationship was to be short-lived in any event, so I can't say I was greatly hurt or resentful. Perhaps you find this off-putting or disquieting. Think what you will of it. I care very little for your judgment. I have lived 700 years, and I have survived by knowing the ways of the world. You eat or you get eaten. You live or you die. You paint whatever morals you like over this reality of yours, and pretend you give a damn about right and wrong, but the animal kingdom has always endured through the weak giving way to the strong, and that is the nature of it. That is how I lived this long. That is how I have prospered and survived. Well, at least until I met him. But I get ahead of myself. After I reached my 400th year, I completed my cultivation and became a yokai, Jorogumo, as humans have dubbed me. Then my relationship with humans changed. They ceased to be mindless and brutish obstacles to be avoided and feared. They became my food. They became prey. I learned how to look human. I took on what I assumed was a pleasing form for human men to look upon. A woman of around 2 or 3 decades in age with raven black hair, a supple figure, a luscious curve to my frame that was pleasing to the eye. It was a strange body to me, and it took me a few days to master it. To walk. To run, to sway my hips and to bat my eyes. I learned how to smile in just the right way. I did not learn speech yet, though. I knew humans could speak through their lips. That was a skill I felt was irrelevant, though, since long experience had taught me that prey cared more for physical beauty and allure than they did for soothing sounds. It was no sound I made that drew food to my web. Therefore, it would not be my new voice that drew food to me. And I was right. My first was a foolish man, a simple peddler lost in the swamp who wandered close to my pond where I'd established my lair. He saw me, and I drew him in. He said many things I did not understand or care about at the time, but my body was all he craved. By the time he knew something was wrong, I'd already led him deep into my home, deep into the moist cave behind the waterfall. And then I let the illusion slip. I remember he screamed then. And that was new for me. Insects do not scream when you trap them. I was temporarily taken aback by that, but not so much that I could not snare him with my silk and drag him back to my fangs. I can assure you, he was not unappetizing. And after him, I perfected my craft. I learned to draw in others. I learned that male humans are easier to snare than females. I learned that some men are armed with weapons that cut and sting. I learned it is important to disarm these humans before revealing my true nature. After doing this for almost a whole century, I had grown comfortable in my craft. I'd fed on enough humans I'd become a rather powerful yokai in the mire. Other yokai knew to avoid me. They knew better than to tread on my pond, my hunting ground. This was my territory, and they would stay away if they valued their lives. I had no issue killing other yokai if necessary. I'd already dispatched a few Kappa, Nireona, and no shortage of very stupid Gaki, who were all too ignorant to understand who it was that reigned in this portion of the mire. It was no secret I had grown powerful and confident. But confidence and complacency are the downfall of the powerful. I had been foolish indeed not to realize that my new status would mean disaster for me. I had been feeding too frequently, killing with too much regularity. I had gained a reputation with not only the yokai, but the humans. Rumors spread about my victims and my prey disappearing, and eventually my home was targeted by not just the humans, but jealous and hopeful yokai who might come to remove me for good. I will never forget the small army of samurai who marched upon my home. I will never forget their swords and spears and clubs. And I will never forget the sense of genuine terror in my breast as I watched those unified warriors, with the aid of the local spirits, cut through my silken snares and wards. When I was just a mere spider, I'd never faced something such as this. I'd never been so arrogant as to believe that I was untouchable. But now I was faced with an overwhelming force, an army that sought my destruction. So I fled. I fled deeper into the mire and as far away from that army of angry ghouls and samurai as I could. It may surprise you to learn I still did not truly hate humans then. I had good reason to, I believe. However, I did not, because their actions were not without merit or understanding. It made sense. I was a threat. I had fed too hungrily and allowed my location and power to be revealed too openly. It's not unlike a nest of hornets or ants rushing out together to attack a frog or a lizard or some other beast near their home. I could understand their behavior. In the end, this was another lesson to learn. So eventually I would find a new place to settle, an abandoned estate deep in the mire that had long been left alone and unrepaired. So overgrown and taken by the foliage and the swamp itself, the place had likely not been occupied for over 500 to 600 years, but it was all academic in any case. I didn't care how long ago the place had been abandoned, only that it was indeed empty. I made some changes to my home this time, though. More thread around the perimeter so as to detect intruders, stronger wards to keep out unwanted guests, and a few back exits in case I needed to flee. I also made myself a new rule. I would avoid eating humans if I could. Feeding on their kinds, while a true delicacy, was also a true risk, and one I could not take lightly again. I did not necessarily need humans to live. I could live off of deer, cows, boar, other animals, and they were all foolish enough to wander into my nest without much coercion, and so in this way I might live and survive as I always had. It was not as enjoyable as before, but that was the price I paid for arrogance. I would accept it. Until I met him. I was around 624 years old when that day came. I remember hearing something in the air I had not heard before. Curiosity took me, and I dared to go and investigate. At that time, I was significantly weaker than I was before. Yokai do not require humans to live, but we grow stronger based on the number of humans and other yokai we consume. Years of abstaining had left me half as capable as I once had been, and for this reason I approached with trepidation and caution. It was as I just began to reach the far edges of my estate that I saw the source of the noise. A human child, but unlike any I'd ever seen before. He was male, and he was small. So very small. I was no expert on human age, but I surmised he couldn't have been older than perhaps a few years, maybe 2. He was pathetic in every essence of the word. Frail, skinny. The clothes he wore scant protection from the bog he now toddled through, scant more than a burlap sack strewn over his pitiful frame. But what struck me as strange about the boy was that he did not appear like the samurai people I'd encountered in the past. His hair was not black like theirs, but instead a filthy blonde. His eyes were not dark, but rather an emerald green. The boy was not one of the children of this swamp. Now I'd heard rumors and tales of humans beyond the mire, knights and Vikings they were called. Was this one of these? I thought this to myself. What was he doing in the mire? Why was he so far from his home? These were my first questions, until a new one surfaced in my mind. Could I eat him? I concluded it was wise not to do so. The boy was pathetically small and would not make a decent meal, for one thing, but not only that, there was a possibility his parents were near, or were searching for him, and their search could lead them to me, and the last thing I needed was more humans here to run me out of my home again. I decided it was best to ignore the child, and so I did. I turned my back on him and returned home. I didn't want to give him another thought. But I did. Something about the child sparked curiosity. I found my thoughts returning to the boy from time to time as I passed the hours in my estate spinning thread, feeding on the entrails of a boar, and remembering the taste of humans. I wondered, did the flesh of these knights and Vikings taste different from the samurai? Cursing myself, that night I returned to see if the boy had remained. To my relief, he hadn't gone far from where I'd left him. He was laying beneath a tree, his face pale and lined with tears as he sobbed and cried. He was beyond pitiful. I knew approaching him in my spider form would only frighten him, so I took the human form I'd once used to lure in human prey. I did not expect it to attract him, but it would at least look passingly familiar and not monstrous. Fortunately, he did not flee or scream at my approach when he took notice of me. I doubt he even had the strength to flee or fight back. He looked emaciated and exhausted. His feet, bare and blistered, were caked in muck and mud. His skin was pocked with bites of mosquitoes, rat bites, and I saw enough dirt on his hide to pollute an entire stateroom. This boy had wandered quite far, it seemed. But why? In the end, he was in no fit state to answer such questions. I simply picked him up and carried him home to tend to his wounds and perhaps have a snack. Suffice to say, I did not eat him. Had I, then I do not suppose there would be much value in hearing my story, would there? If you're wondering why I did not just bite down and feed on this pathetic creature in the moment I had the chance, I cannot give an honest answer to that because I do not honestly know myself. Perhaps it was curiosity, the desire to learn more about this strange child. Perhaps it was just sheer boredom. After so many decades of isolation and hiding, perhaps having a creature aside from myself in my home was something of an indulgence of whimsy. I didn't know. I did know that he was filthy. At first, I kept him in a private area of the estate and left him there, wondering if he'd get on his own and leave. He didn't, of course. Instead, he stopped crying and went very still for a long time, barely breathing. He was obviously starved, so I brought him some of the boar meat. He couldn't eat it. It then occurred to me that humans needed cooked meat. I don't remember where I'd learned this, but I did remember it. I set a fire and cooked it, with very mixed results. I'd never had to cook food before, so I was new to it. At first, I overcooked it, turning it black and very untasty. Then I didn't cook it long enough, and I could still smell the blood. It was an infuriating series of trials and errors, and I'd almost wasted the whole damn carcass. But at last, I was able to feed the boy. What turned into passing interest turned into a daily routine. I found myself bringing food to the boy regularly. Always cooked, of course. After 3 days of this, he began to eat by his own hand rather than by holding it to his mouth to convince him to consume it. I brought him water from the river, and I observed him eating and drinking the food prepared for him. He never spoke, and I privately wondered if he knew how. In the end, it didn't matter. I had to remind myself he was nothing but a potential meal. After almost a week or two of this routine, I actually found myself somewhat learning to appreciate it. I contrasted it to how I'd been living previously, and I discovered this was more entertaining than passing time in sleep, meditation, and hunting. By the 3rd week, the child finally started venturing from his room to follow me, though he still had a very healthy fear of me. He was not good at hiding his presence. I would be walking through the garden and hear his footsteps, but when I would turn, I would see his little figure scramble to hide behind a post or a wall or a bush. It was a wonder he'd survived in the mire as long as he had with such pitiful survival skills. It was amusing, though, to watch him attempt to tail me. However, knowing that he was observing me left me constantly in human form. I didn't want him to see my spider form and risk him fleeing my home. After all, he was still to be my snack eventually. It was about the 3rd or 4th month of my time with the boy that he finally began walking about openly, daring to allow me to witness his movements. There was still some degree of caution to him. He gave me a wide berth and always watched me as if he expected me to pounce, but he did not seem to see me as an immediate danger. More fool him, I suppose. His body was no longer as pale or emaciated, so that was at least something. However, he was still very filthy, and even when I was a spider, I knew that filth can lead to disease and sickness. He would have to be cleaned. I still could not speak, but I believe he couldn't either, as I never heard him do so. I instead led him to the river by simply walking there. When I reached the bank, I pointed to it, expecting him to get in. But to my surprise, he did not obey. Instead, he looked from it to me in confusion and in fear. I pointed at him, and then the river again. I pointed at him, and then the river again, but he still did not grasp my intentions. So, impatiently, I lay hands on him and threw him into the river. He splashed around and squealed like the child he was, and then sank beneath the water. And it was then it dawned on me that he couldn't swim. I fished him out and tossed him onto the bank, where he cried and blubbered pathetically again, and I found myself rather annoyed by this useless boy. He could do nothing, understand nothing, provide nothing. As I glared at his soaking wet and pitiful form, laying on the ground and coughing, whimpering, I felt in my heart a deep irritation that melted like snow before a spring sun. Why did I not despise him? I don't think I liked him very much, but I also knew I held no hatred, and despite his utter and deplorable uselessness, I simply could not despise the boy. With an irritated sneer, I walked around him and back towards home, with him toddling and sniffling after me, his clothes sopping wet. I set another fire and allowed him to dry himself beside it, while I considered what was to be done about him, since I now knew he was never to be my meal. I would reach my decision a week later, when the boy did something unexpected and entirely unwelcome. I awoke one morning to feel something unusual. It was colder that morning, as winter had started to come to the mire. The air was not as muggy and thick, but instead cold and windy. I stirred when I felt a weight against me. I turned to see the boy laying against my body, curled up and cold. I leapt back in horror and disgust. This human boy, this creature, once foe, once prey, was now nuzzling to me as though I were its mother. I was distraught with disbelief and revulsion. The child stirred at my movement and looked up at me, shivering from the chill of the air, and I snarled at it angrily. How dare it presume to try and approach me like that? But it was as I raged and spat that I noticed the boy was shaking ever further. His lips were blue, his eyes bloodshot. He was sick. I learned that humans cannot hibernate as I can. They do not withstand the cold as do most mammalians. The cold weakens them, and it can hurt them. But this was as far as I was able to go with the boy. The child had grown too comfortable with me now. He had seen me less as a threat and more as a guardian, and I was not going to allow this any longer. He may not be my prey, but I am not his caretaker. I had to rid myself of him. Now perhaps you think I am callous for this, that I am some cold-blooded beast. Bear in mind that I have already refrained from hurting the child, and I had done far more than enough to simply prevent him from dying. I had no further use or inclination towards the boy, so I was happy to be done with him. I bound him in silk so as to help him stay warm, and then I carried his trembling frame through the mire to find a home among his kind. My human appearance would allow me to pass easily enough for others, and though I could not speak their language, I did not need to speak for this. I would find him a place in the village or town, drop him off, and let him become the problem of another. I had gone very deep into the mire when I first fled out to this estate, so I knew it would be quite a long trek before I came across human civilization. However, after almost half a day of walking, I began to see signs of humans. Trees cut down to make way for roads and paths, footsteps out of place in the muck, and even signs of campgrounds and shelters for the wandering vagabond or warrior. There was a village just beyond these signs, a simple samurai fishing town, by my own guess. I slipped within the town with ease and delivered the child at the front door of a small house. Stepping away quickly, I hid and waited to ensure the family took the boy. It took perhaps half an hour before someone noticed him, and then they shoved him away. One passing man spat at him, in fact. I was stunned. Why did they mistreat the child? I moved swiftly to remove him from the situation. He did not cry out or scream. He was too weary and sick for that. And I would learn later why they hated him so. The boy was Ashfeldian, not of the mire. It seemed humans divided themselves by certain categories. I could understand that. Yokai divide each other in similar terms, but the difference is that yokai are not made equal. A Jorogumo is not like a Kitsune. A Tengu is not like a Gaki. I did not see the difference between the child and these people. Was it really just their physical difference? The hair and eye color? Was that it? The shape of his face versus theirs? It seemed a petty thing. But I had no interest in arguing the point. It wasn't my business. If these humans would not take in the child, I would have to find ones who would. But this was a near impossible task, I found out. I learned something new about humanity in those days of searching. They were remarkably resentful and cold creatures at times. I began learning how to speak the language of humans then. This is not a hard thing for a yokai of my power. In truth, I could have learned the skill any time I wanted, but as I had said, I never saw the necessity. But now I had to learn. I had to get information. It took a few days to study and finally learn the patterns, but I grasped the basics very quickly. Does this surprise you? Remember, I'm not human. Your limitations are not mine. But along with learning language and speech, I also fashioned myself with a name. Shiori. Through this newly acquired skill of mine and my new name, I asked around for information about the child and his origins. There were few willing to help me, fewer still who did not look upon my sickly companion with anything more than disdain. And at that moment I really started to detest these humans. Not for what they were, mind you, but because of their own animosity. It was one thing to hate me. I'm a monster to their kind. But this child had done nothing to them. Was nothing to them. But on I went, seeking a home for this boy and caring for him as best as I was able. It was in a village called Nishikamo, where I finally gained some information that was useful to me. Ashfeld, the land from which the boy hailed, was 3 days' walk to the west, and his people would be more willing to take him. The boy was likely the child of a traveling merchant or missionary group, and his family was killed by samurai or ronin. Fortunately, they were not the only ones. According to the monk I spoke to, he explained that there were always merchants, caravans, and missionaries traveling between the regions in search of selling and trading wares. I could either take the child all the way to Ashfeld, or I could hand him off to Ashfeldian travelers when they came by. I was relieved, and I began thinking of the best way to approach these caravans. I just wanted to finally hand over the boy to those who could care for him better than I could, and I could finally be rid of him. In hindsight, I think I genuinely believed that lie, as I told it to myself. In all the times we traveled together, the boy did not complain, argue, or even attempt to flee. As his sickness waxed and waned in intensity, he was remarkably compliant to anything I had told him or led him to do. If I offered him to a family or wanderer, he did not resist me, though he often gave me pained looks. Only on the day I finally found a way to get rid of him did he protest. It was 5 days after I'd been told about the trading caravans that I actually happened across one. I was walking with the boy to an out-of-the-way village where I saw 5 men with a large wooden cart of wools, vegetables, textiles, silks, and other wares. I also noticed they were an amalgamation of different builds and styles. A few had dark hair, not unlike the samurai, but others had blonde and red hair. I saw one with hair that appeared almost blue in the light lighting. Also, none had the same facial features as the samurai. These were outsiders of the Maya, and I had at last found my chance. I approached and spoke to them of the child with me and requested their aid. Their leader, a squat and rather portly-looking fellow with watery eyes and patched hair, looked quite excited by the news. He introduced himself as Mandeville and said that their company was familiar with an orphanage in Ashfeld that they could take the boy to. So I was beyond relieved. But when I told the boy to go with them, for the first time, he shook his head in fright and refused. "No," he said meekly, and it was the first word I'd ever heard him utter. I didn't like it. I told him to go with them, but he still refused. I sneered and threatened him to go, and that I had no desire to keep him. He still refused, backing away from me and the merchants fearfully. At last I snapped at him, grabbed him by his tattered clothing, and handed him to Mandeville in a fury. The boy screamed, kicking and thrashing, but I was stronger, and shoved him into Mandeville's arms. Before he could ask any more questions, I stormed away and marched off the path and back into the mire, back to my estate and my isolation, the screams and howling of the child echoing behind me as I walked away. I walked, and walked, further and further, not necessarily going anywhere. In fact, I didn't even know if I was going back to my home, or I was just trying to walk away from him. I was so desperate to rid myself of that child that I think I just wanted to keep walking until maybe normalcy returned to me. But with each step, with each tree I passed, an animal that fled my presence, I felt a sense of wrongness. He was just a child, a human boy who I had no obligation to. So why did I miss him? Curse me. I was actually feeling the weight of my solitude now. I'd never realized how empty my home felt without that little brat in it. I knew I had not made a mistake, you understand, but that does not mean I didn't feel remorse. It's like making a decision that you're aware is necessary, but it is one that is very unpleasant. This was a foreign sensation for me. I'd never truly cared or liked anything or anyone before now. But that child, somehow knowing he was not here any longer, was actually painful. Despite my better judgment, I decided to find out the fate of that merchant caravan and the child. As a Jorogumo, I am queen and mother to spiders. All spiders answer my whim and command and speak to me when commanded. I called upon my subjects now to find the caravan and the boy and inform me that they had made it to Ashfeld safely. I then entered a quiet meditation and waited for the news to reach me, and also tried my best to let go of this meaningless attachment. Days passed, and I heard nothing. I caught a few deer over those days and had plenty to eat. I had to remind myself more than once I did not have to cook the meat this time for the child, and that knowledge did not bring me solace or relief. How was it that the absence of responsibility was only bringing me more sadness? It was foolishness and beneath me, but I could no more deny it than I could deny myself. It was on one day in particular, at long last, a few of my children appeared to me, scurrying before me as though before a monarch. I did not speak to them as I speak to humans now, for spiders have no need for voice. Ours is the speech of the silk, plucking the threads at our feet to show meaning and to share knowledge. So from their arrival my fingers ran along the silk, and it was then, to my shock, I realized I had not resumed my true spider form. I had remained in the form of a human woman. Why? Why did I feel so at ease this way? I had only maintained it for the child's benefit, and he was no longer here. I cursed myself for my emotional weakness, but shook it off as my fingers strummed the silk to ask for news.
"The caravan did not pass into Ashfeld," they explained quickly. "The merchants are still in the mire."
Why? I asked calmly.
"They are not as they seem,"
the largest of the spiders spoke darkly.
"They are likened to thee, my mistress."
At this, I felt a cold sensation rush up my body, a fear like I had felt the day that army came and chased me from my first home. "Are they yokai?" I demanded furiously.
"Not like the ones we know,"
the spider answered solemnly.
"They are like Oni, yet not like them at all. Our sisters in Ashfeld call them ogres."
The fear in my heart turned almost at once to rage, a hatred that I had not felt in any recollection of my life. It took my body and took my soul like a fever. I rose to my feet fast, arming myself with a naginata, a favored weapon I'd collected from the samurai who once tried to hunt me. A trophy once, now the instrument of my vengeance. "Take me to them." They were easy to find. I cursed myself for not having realized what they were on sight. As yokai, I should have been able to detect the illusion cast upon them, to hide their true nature, and yet I had not. Perhaps in my eagerness to rid myself of the child, I had chosen to ignore what was right in front of me. Suddenly, his fear and panic back then made so much sense. Did he see them for what they were, better than I could? But then that led to another question. Did he see me for what I was? I had little time to ponder that, though, for I had found the hideout of the ogres. There were 5 in total, and without their human disguises, I saw their true selves. They did indeed have a striking resemblance to the Oni, though perhaps even more brutish. Large, with varying skin pigments ranging from pale gray to dark, sickly green. They had large snouts and pointed ears, all of them, but what struck me with their smell and rancid and disgusting odor of rotten meat, carrion, and mildew, the air around them seemed to permeate with that outrageous fragrance. I'd smelled worse, for sure, but it had been years since then. The ogres sat, talked, huddling around a large bonfire near a cave. They had crude weaponry with them, axes, large clubs, and a sword even bigger than they were. I was not intimidated by their bulk, their weaponry, or their stench. None of it mattered. I stepped forward into the light of the fire, my human form still showing. If they had any intelligence locked in their useless skulls, then they should have registered I was not human when they looked at me. I was unsurprised when they acted unfazed.
"Was this, then?"
one growled, standing up and grabbing his axe.
"You the bitch who gave us the kid, aren't ya?"
I didn't answer him as I walked forward, my eyes glaring daggers into his. He had just enough sense to finally take a step back from me.
"If you're open to reclaim the kid, you're out of luck."
Does he live? I snarled. I put as much of my power into each word I spoke, and this actually resonated with the beasts, as they genuinely showed discomfort now, standing and shifting on their lumpy legs.
"It no business of yours,"
his comrade snapped. Good. The boy was alive. If they had already eaten him, they would have said so from the offset. Feigning ignorance meant they didn't want me to retrieve him. But I didn't relax. I merely marched towards the closest ogre. I did not slow my pace, and I drew back my naginata.
"Stop right there and drop the spear,"
the ogre snapped. I didn't flinch. He raised his axe.
"I said stop, or I'll hack you in two,"
it barked. I charged him faster. I knew he wouldn't move. I knew he would not even try to kill me. I've learned that for some fools, they crave power and obedience from others, and the dead can't follow orders. So by the time he understood I wasn't going to obey him, I wasn't going to give him obedience, he'd already be far too late to act. I saw the sheer terror light up in his eyes like a candle being ignited, and my blade took his head off at the throat. Black blood spurt from his throat like a geyser, and I opened my mouth to catch it, raining down on my face, letting it splash and spittle on my brow, on my cheeks, on my lips, on my tongue. It'd been so long since I tasted the blood of yokai, of the sentient. And I can tell you, there's nothing like it. I would have laughed with relief had I not been still so blinded with anger. As the headless fool fell to his knees and then to the ground in a heap, I rounded on the other four. The one with the giant sword found his nerve first and thundered towards me. To a mortal he would have appeared monstrous and imposing. I only saw a mad hunk of meat charging to meet his death, a fly charging face first into the web, unaware of how woefully unprepared it was. My spear took it in the chest with force I'm sure it didn't expect. However, it too was not without strength. I felt the shaft of the spear creak with pressure as I held off the behemoth. I stepped back and removed the spear before stabbing again at its face. The thing howled in agony as the spear went clean through its eye. I was privately impressed by its resilience. They were indeed equitable to Oni. But it's a shame, as Oni are no threat to me either. I thrust my hand forward, and it sank through his flesh until I could grab the monster's pounding heart. With a feral hiss, I yanked out the still pounding organ and wrenched it out from his body. I held the heart in my hand and crushed it, spraying the black and vile fluids within over me. I did this not just for the sake of thirst, but for the spectacle. I needed them frightened. I wanted them fully aware of who they stood before. The heartless ogre fell back, stupidly clutching at the hole in his chest, and then gurgling some distasteful noise as it died at my feet. At last, the nature of what I was seemed to be sinking in for his companions. Perhaps a little further demonstration was required to drive the point home. So I allowed a little bit of my illusion to slip. I allowed two of my great spider legs to burst from behind my shoulders, like two mighty chitinous appendages reaching out over me as though to stab, scratch, snare, and catch. My eyes turned to a pale white, and my hair lost the black luster I used to hide the snow-white hair that I actually sported. Now the ogres were aware. They knew now, and they dropped their weapons to flee. Their final mistake. The three fools hadn't made more than 5 paces before their movements altogether ceased. Their limbs slowed and twitching to a stop. Their bodies hung suspended as if frozen in air itself. Their muscles spasmed and fought, struggling to move and to resist the tethers that now binded them. Useless struggle against my snares. My silk had already taken them. They had not noticed it, because they were feeble and mindless creatures. Prey to one such as myself. Their porcine features observed my approach, and they began to panic.
"Wait!"
one cried, and I recognized his voice as the one called Mandeville, the same one I'd given the boy to.
"Please, just wait! We surrender! Let's cut a deal, huh? You're a Midian like us. We can work out something. Yeah, we cut it. We want you want to cut of the humans? We'll share him. We'll share him all with you, or we'll leave. We'll just leave. Yeah, we'll go back to Ashfeld and
Surrender? I interrupted, silencing his babbling. Deals? You misunderstand. I did not come to negotiate with you, or to reason with you. I have come here simply to destroy you. What you choose to do in response is entirely your concern, not mine. Do what you want with your remaining moments of life. Cry, beg, pray, fight, soil yourself. I don't particularly care. And as I spoke, I smiled, allowing my face to adopt a more horrific aspect so they could see more of what I was. My eyes multiplied on my face. My mouth widened into a smile exposing venomous fangs. I was a vision of mortal nightmares. And then they chose what they would do next. They screamed. I discovered the boy hung like a piece of meat in their cave, naked and bloody from cuts and strikes. He was alive, thankfully, but unconscious when I found him. I cut him down and carried him away from there, quietly and with a soft hand. I made sure to keep his face away from the corpses behind me. He didn't need to see that. I carried him the many miles back to my estate, and for the first time as I walked, every entity in the forest felt my passing. Feeding on the ogres, the so-called Midians, had restored much of my former strength, and I was again feared. And I liked it. This was who I was. I was not a cowardly little spiderling cowering in her estate with the threats of the world outside of it. I was Jorogumo. I was a powerful and venerated yokai, a weaver of death and calamity. That was who I was and how I would live. But that also meant I was no mother to human children. Though I was glad to have rescued the boy, I knew I could not keep him near me. He was my greatest treasure now, but also my greatest hindrance. I could not be myself when with him. He simply had to go, but that could wait until he was well enough to understand. So I brought him home, and it felt very nostalgic to go back to tending to his useless, meaningless, pitiful, but precious form. He awoke with wide eyes and happy cheers upon seeing me. He even had the audacity to embrace my middle. I allowed it, though I grimaced in frustration. I pried him off, and I knelt down to face him. My eyes looked into his, and I waited until his smile had faded to a simple grin. Knowing he was listening, I spoke. "You cannot stay with me," I told him. "You are human. I am yokai. I am a monster to you, and you are food to me. Staying here will not help either of us. I was wrong to give you away to those beasts, but I was not wrong to find you a new home. So tomorrow, I will take you to Ashfeld, and there you will stay." I don't know if he understood half of what I said, and yet he seemed to grasp the meaning, for his face fell and he shook his head. "No," he squeaked, like he had been back that way when I'd wanted to get rid of him before. I'd snapped at him then. I'd threatened him and forcibly thrown him at strangers just to see him gone, but this time I did not shout, or snap, or strike. I reached out and placed a hand on his head with as much softness as I felt I was able. "Yes," I answered. That one word was given with force, but also enough grief that I could tell he knew that I didn't want it any more than he did. It took us a whole month to finally reach Ashfeld and give him over to a church there. I had taken the form of a Nobushi of the mire again so as to fit in with human society, and it seemed to work well enough for my needs. Some people questioned a samurai walking with an Ashfeldian boy, but there was also my sheer aura that made people nervous to be near me. That helped. In the end, the boy had been agreeable, particularly when he seemed to know I wasn't just trying to truly rid myself of him this time around. The man I left him with was a kindly soul, at least so far as I could tell. I'm not necessarily an expert on judging human character, but I knew there were spiders in his church, and they would report to me if there was any problems. I placed my hand only once more on the child, and then bid him goodbye. As I turned to leave, he chased me once more to embrace me again. I let him. I allowed him this one final concession before I let him go forever. He held on tightly, gripping my silk clothing in his little hands. I waited a few minutes before I finally let him go and stroked his hair one more time. And then I left. I returned to the mire, and though I still missed him, I did not feel the same pain as when I first got rid of him. I resigned myself back to my old life, and to the life I was always meant for, as a Jorogumo. A quarter of a century passed in that time. I had grown considerably stronger. I fed on yokai and the occasional wandering lost human bandit, ronin, or samurai, or any other drunken fool who was too stupid to know how to avoid my estate. I was more careful with how frequently I ate, and upon whom, so as to never draw more suspicion to me as I had before. I had regained much of who I once was, and I was quite pleased in it. I was not complacent to the point of ignorance and foolishness like before, but I was no longer living as a starved coward. That child had not taught me any great lesson of love or familial bonds, maybe, but rather he simply taught me there was something worth living on for. One misty morning, I felt the subtle shifting of threads outside my home, the breaking and tugging of lines set to inform me of the approach of food. I left my chambers to see what had wandered into my territory. There was a figure outside of the estate, a man wearing simple vestments. They were not likened to those of the samurai, but more like some I'd seen on travelers from beyond. He looked like some kind of minor nobility or lord, but he was alone. No guards or protectors. Easy prey. I stepped out of hiding in my human form to draw him in, and then I froze as I beheld this man, and I felt my heart stop in my chest. He had grown. He was tall, his hair shorter now, cut close just along the sides of his head above his ears. His eyes were still green, and he had soft stubble under his chin. He was grinning that same annoying smile. I stared at him and I blinked. Could this be that same boy? Had he really come back? Was he really here to see me?
You see, Portia?
The boy said, speaking behind him. From behind his legs, I saw a little girl step out, looking at me, with hair of long brown tied in a braid, and wide, very familiar green eyes, just like the man. Just like the boy.
I told you.
Your grandmother is beautiful. I simply do not understand humans.